Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CG podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. I'm just delighted to have my guest, Bethany McLean, with us today. Bethany is an American journalist and contributing editor for Vanity Fair Magazine. She's previously worked for Fortune and Slate, investigating financial markets and including the role of Enron and the Enron scandal in the past. And she's the author, along with Joe Nocera, of the book, The Big Fail, What the Pandemic Revealed About Who America Protects and Who It Leaves Behind, which was published at the end of 2023. And the book has been featured among other places in New York Magazine, and that's where I first became aware of it. So it's great to have you, Bethany, on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump right into it. I'm curious about what motivated you to write this book and sort of the story behind the title and other things.
So Joe and I have made almost a career out of covering stories of business gone wrong, big economic calamities. I guess we're a little bit like ambulance chasers in that sense. When something blows up, we're there. So he had previously helped me on my Enron book. We wrote a book about the financial crisis together called All the Devils Are Here. And so when COVID hit, we immediately said, well, this is an economic crisis as well. And so there should be a book about that. But the book really expanded from there because I think we were struck originally by how quickly, in America and I think elsewhere too, but the pandemic divided us, and how a lot of the methods to cope with the pandemic seem to reward the wealthy and the well-off at the expense of those who are not so well off. And just for an example on that, I felt very strongly, starting pretty early, that kids needed to be back in school. It was really clear, looking at even the initial data out of China and Italy, who COVID was affecting and who it wasn't affecting. And I realized there are still questions around how much children transmit. But I still thought that it was the economically disadvantaged children in the US, the very people we were supposed to be protecting, who we were failing the most badly. And so I would tweet about that. And I remember getting an email from the husband of a friend of mine saying, I didn't realize you were a Trump voter. And I said, well, what on earth do your politics have to do with how we should handle a pandemic? I mean, can you imagine if somebody said, well, if you're a Democrat, you treat cancer this way, and if you're a Republican, you treat cancer that way? And so I was immediately struck by how quickly COVID, the way we should respond to COVID, became a marker of either your virtue or your lack of virtue, but it became a political ideology. And I still think that's one of the strangest things about the whole pandemic. So we attempted, with hopefully some degree of success, to weave that all into one story.
So did you approach the book almost as a project in therapy, or to try to understand your own society and what it was going through during the time?
It was really an effort to try to figure out why it was that we had to latch on to mitigation measures for COVID as the marker of political ideology. But it was also, for me, I've long been interested in the questions of where capitalism works and where it doesn't work. And I think there are some key places in which capitalism isn't working as one might wish it to in an ideal society. And we saw that in the pandemic, when suddenly we couldn't get our hands on respirators or masks or any kind of personal protective equipment because all the manufacturing had been outsourced to China. And it turns out that this very taut global supply chain that is supposed to deliver more and more profits to corporations' bottom line is a really fragile thing. And it doesn't take much to make it to make it snap. And so I started to think also about these questions of what's the cost of resilience, and shouldn't we have some resilience in addition to having more and more profits now? And at least the way capitalism is working in the United States, it doesn't encourage that kind of resilience. It encourages bottom line profits now, and who cares about the cost down the road?
Okay, no, interesting. And so kind of going back to the origins of the book, was this something that you thought up quite early in 2020, or is it something, at what point did you say, okay, we're going to write a book about COVID?
It was pretty early. I think it must have been in April or May of 2020. And we originally thought we would have the book done much more quickly than we'd ended up getting it done, as many authors, as happens to many authors. But this really it was a particularly difficult book because the story is so sprawling. Even the decision to focus on the US and not really to engage with how COVID was handled in other countries, other than for the sake of comparisons of mitigation measures. but you could fault that. So there were a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different directions you could go with a book like this. So it was really challenging.
And when you think about the range of books, COVID books, right? There's a lot of them. There's a lot focused on the U.S., but I would actually say that this is a relatively unique book. And what kind of conversations did you have with publishers, or what's your sense of where the book fits within the sort of small literature focused on the COVID in the U.S.?
Well, I think the problem is it doesn't fit because COVID is, as we've touched on, so polarizing. So people have said to me, people who don't know me have said, when I read your book, I can't tell if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And so the book doesn't please people on either extreme, because we came out pretty strongly against lockdowns and against some of the mitigation measures that were employed. But the book is also critical of the way capitalism is working in America right now. So it just doesn't fit a particular political ideology. And if you if you do identify yourself by your politics and you want to read a book that challenges you and makes you rethink things and is going to make you angry in certain places, then it's a great book. But if you want to read a book that corroborates everything that you already think, then I think it's a challenging book. I think that does make it unique. I don't think anybody has taken the approach we have, and at least in America, there's still a pretty stunning resistance to looking at the mitigation measures that were employed and asking the really basic question: did these work? Did these make sense?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a good illustration of that is your treatment of the Great Barrington Declaration. So Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta, et cetera, who are trustees of Collateral Global, the sort of the think tank that is running the podcast. So, I mean, okay. I mean, so you said you set out to understand, these divides in America. Have you come up with any nuggets of truth? What was sort of your conclusion here?
I have not come up with any nuggets of truth. I still fail to understand it. And you just mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration. It's really astounding about that. If you look back to the press coverage around it, even the message from the American public health establishment, from Dr. Fauci, these are fringe scientists. Fringe scientist, an epidemiologist at Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Oxford. Fringe? Why can't we have a conversation about this? Why can't we talk about this? Why do these people have to be dismissed? And not just dismissed, but dismissed in a really bordering on untruthful way. And I wish I had an answer for why we are this way. I think one answer I've come up with is just that the world is so complicated that identifying with a particular political party makes everything easier. Then you don't have to think for yourself. Does a lockdown make sense? You're a Democrat, so of course it makes sense. It's the virtuous and correct thing to do. And I wonder if that's part of it. Part of it is Trump, obviously. He was such a divisive figure here that anything he said, it became a marker of who you were to say, no. And I think that's one reason America was so slow to open its schools. But the political divides exist elsewhere too. So I don't think that Trump is a reason for that. I think another answer is inequality. It really has widened sharply, particularly wealth inequality. And I think that when people can't have what other people have and can't have safe places for their children to live and safe schools that will let them advance through life, I think that causes a lot of divides as well. But I don't have a great answer for it. I would just argue that it's an incredibly big problem.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, so yeah, incredibly complicated topic. So let's dive into the financial markets. So this is something that you've written a lot about in the past. You've written books, et cetera. And you do talk about this quite a lot in the book. And I think that's a unique contribution here. You talk about the economic crisis that was really huge storm clouds were brewing early on, right? And with financial markets. Can you just take us through that section of the book and sort of maybe some things that many people don't know about?
Yeah, so I think it does make the book really different. I think most people want to say the Federal Reserve came to the rescue of financial markets, which were tottering only due to the fear of the pandemic. And wow, how amazing that the Fed was able to rescue the financial system and rescue the global financial system and step into the breach, and markets soared. Isn't that fantastic? And look at all the spending that the U.S. did in order to, in fairness, try to get money not just to the wealthy but to the less well off. And isn't that fantastic? Let's not even ask about the legacy of this. And I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. I think that the reason the Fed had to step into the breach was because COVID was the trigger, but because financial markets in the years since the global financial crisis have become more fragile rather than less fragile due to a variety of complicated things. But each time the Fed steps in to fix things, they have to step in a bigger and bigger way and do things that are very much outside what their purview was supposed to be. And you may say, who cares? Except it raises a couple of questions. Why does the Fed have to rescue institutions like money market funds that aren't supposed to be part of the Fed's safety net? And doesn't this pose a problem if the markets get used to the Fed always stepping in and saving things? That's not the way markets are supposed to work. And then the third problem it causes is that when the Fed steps in, financial markets soar, asset prices soar, and that again delivers a huge benefit to the well-off by creating froth in financial markets. But there's a cost to that. It doesn't deliver anything to the people in our society who don't own assets. And the froth itself is dangerous. Leads to a lot of deals getting done and things getting financed that arguably shouldn't be. And I sound a little bit like a Cassandra here, and I would have been wrong over the decade after the financial crisis, because every time you think the Fed can't prop this up anymore and markets can't keep going higher, they do. But then the Fed also got the inflation call wrong. They were continuing to be very accommodative and pump money into the markets until far too late in the game. And so the fact that inflation, which once again hurts those who are the least well off, is as problematic as it is also to some degree reflective of Fed policies and Fed choices. So I guess to sum up, I guess I'm more critical of the Fed than most people probably would be, who just want to say, amazing, the Fed saved us all.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, do you just kind of walk us through some of the figures of how the Fed responded to the pandemic, like in terms of the different programs that they had, how much cash they injected into the economy, and also if you have some thoughts around alternatives that they could have pursued that were not done.
Well, I don't think the Fed had many choices when COVID hit, because the choices were made in the decade leading up to the crisis, not to stabilize the financial system. When you think back at the COVID, when the global financial crisis hit afterwards, we all said, "Oh, the shadow banking system. It's this dangerous thing of non-bank financial institutions that provide a lot of credit, and that's partly to blame for the financial crisis." Who would have guessed that the shadow banking system is many times its size a decade later, not smaller, not more managed, not controlled? I don't think there's much the Fed could have done other than what it did by the time that the pandemic hit. And Jerome Powell, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he survived Donald Trump, and Biden has kept him in place, and he's by almost anyone's measure a really well-intentioned man who is willing to step into the breach. But I think he has allowed the Fed to become more subject to market pressures. There's a lot out there now. What happens if Trump gets elected? Does the Fed lose its independence? I think the Fed has already lost its independence, because the Fed has to placate markets, because the markets do now whatever the Fed says, and that's just not the role that the Federal Reserve was ever supposed to play. Anyway, they threw trillions of dollars at the system. They offered to rescue everything from subprime auto loans to municipal debt, just areas that the Fed has arguably were beyond its authority. Although you can get creative in what's legal. And it just, if the financial crisis already was a huge expansion of the Fed's authority, this was that times 10.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of those the research that I've seen published in economics journals haven't been very supportive of those, at least the government spending programs, which are different from the Fed spending. The effectiveness of the government spending, but this is obviously a different area. In the book, do you talk about the different government sort of support programs for businesses and individuals as well?
Yeah, we do. And I do think that this does mark a difference from the financial crisis, where America bailed out the banks and did not do anything to support homeowners. This was a real intent to get money to small businesses and to ordinary Americans. The problem is none of our systems are set out to do that. It's very easy to get money to the wealthy through cutting interest rates and letting asset price soar and the wealthy get richer. Really hard to find a mechanism to get money to people and to get money to small businesses. businesses. So there was a ton of fraud in the loan program that was directed towards small businesses, and it didn't work very well, and it worked randomly. But you know what? They did it, and they got it done. And I'm a little bit less critical of that than some might be, even despite the fraud. I think you would have an even more divided society if the government had not made any effort to rescue ordinary people, and that would be really just socially awful. That said, the government threw a lot of money at this through both Trump's program and then Biden's program, and arguably that too has contributed to inflation, and it's also contributed to what may become unsustainable levels of debt. So there's a cost to everything, and I think we forget that. We tend to think that what the Fed does or what the government does is free money, because it was for a lot of decades when inflation stayed low. But it's not. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Isn't that the first rule of economics?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, supposedly. One of the most perplexing things that I experienced, though, was you had the beginning of the pandemic. You had lockdown, then you had these government spending programs around the world, in the EU as well, et cetera. And then you had inflation that started to take off. And if you followed the media cycle, there was very little discussion of this inflation is connected to our spending program that we just had about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. How did you experience that time?
Well, I think the unwillingness to look at either the financial measures that were employed or the public health measures that were employed is one of the oddest features of the pandemic, because it's so important and the repercussions are so big, both throughout the world's financial systems and for people. And I don't. And you're right about that. No one wanted to say this. In fact, I think a lot of economists went out of their way to say this wasn't caused by pandemic era spending, because they don't want to criticize the spending and don't want to look at it too closely. And so I think that this unwillingness to examine what we did is yet another one of the odd features of the aftermath of the pandemic.
Yeah. And I mean, you think if we're going to be facing another health emergency and we want to think about, okay, how do you do fiscal policy in that situation? Having a good postmortem of American, financial policy during the pandemic is absolutely critical. And I actually remember bumping into somebody who works at the Fed at a conference and exactly asking them that exact question about research. And they just said, people don't want to touch it. Like, you can only criticize policy so far before you're seen as a rogue and you're going to be shown the door. So there's a reticence, in the Fed, in the government, and also in the academic community, which kind of gets back to your early point about, left versus right. And, a lot of economists were very critical of criticizing COVID policies very early on.
Well, Two quick thoughts on that. I mean, one is that, yes, there is very much within the Fed a culture of don't step out of line. And unfortunately, that spreads to economists everywhere, because economists want to be included in all of the Fed's things. And a lot of economists have cycled in and out of the Fed. And so there is this very strong reluctance to criticize anything that the Fed has done. But the other point I wanted to make is that the two are linked. The mitigation policies and the financial measures are linked, because if we hadn't had lockdowns, you wouldn't have had to do the mitigation policies that you did. You probably still would have done something. There would have been some people who were afraid to go out and afraid to go outside, but you wouldn't have needed nearly the amount of government spending that you needed. So these two things are intrinsically linked.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. Good point. So kind of final question here. Do you think America has learned the right lessons from COVID? So if we have another COVID-like respiratory pandemic in a year or 2 years, do you think we'll respond in a different way or a similar way? And let's say the Democrats are in power, just for the sake of argument. What do you see transpiring?
So no, I don't think we've learned anything. If anything, I think things have gotten worse, because one of the markers of a society's ability to respond to something like a pandemic is the level of trust that society has in its institutions and in its government. And trust is completely broken here, in part because the public health and others are unwilling to look at these questions and say, what did we do wrong? What could we have done better? Why did we get this wrong? And so it's just this la where people who question some of the measures that were employed are left on the fringes. And so if another pandemic comes, there can be a substantial portion of Americans who just don't believe anything that the government tells them to do. And I think that's a huge problem. And we're heading into an election that is going to be incredibly divisive. And so it all worries me quite a bit. I do see there is some, at the risk of being a little bit Pollyannish, there does seem to be a little bit of awareness among people I talk to that you need to grapple with points of view that aren't your own, and a little more willingness to think that way. But I don't know how far that goes.
How has your book been received from by people in your social circles, or it seems like you're more of a Democrat, left leaning, by those that you write with, and also a related question: was it hard to get think pieces out during the pandemic, which is also a barometer maybe of that question?
Yeah, so we didn't do many pieces during the pandemic, but because the book was so difficult and overwhelming. But the book did meet with silence, and it's really hard to know why that is. It was published right after the horrible events of October in Israel. And so that also very legitimately, of course, knocked it out of the coverage we had been willing to get. But the book was not reviewed really anywhere in any major publications in the US. And while that sounds a little bit grandiose of me to complain about that, everything I've written and everything Joe has written has gotten reviewed in the past. So it just met with silence. And I think in part that's because people just don't want to grapple with it. And it does not line up with what a lot of people already think. And so I think it's had a hard time finding its audience because it has been met with so much silence. And that's a powerful tool for things that people don't want to hear, is just ignore them and maybe make them go away.
Yeah. And also an indication of why people should be talking and reading the book itself, right? If we're living in such a polarizing time when we can't even debate basic questions of public policy that have huge implications for, how much our groceries are in the grocery store today. So, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. That was Bethany McLean, the author, along with Joe Nocera, of The Big Fail: What the Pandemic Revealed About Who America Protects and Who It Leaves Behind. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. It was really delightful.